At some point, you've probably asked yourself, why is there so much conflict in the Middle East? There are many reasons for this, but they all come out of one big cause, the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916. This was a secret agreement between France and the UK, carving up the Middle East between themselves over the ruins of what would eventually be the defeated Ottoman Empire. The Middle Eastern states that were formed through this agreement were ticking time bombs. The consequences of Sykes-Picot are still felt all throughout the Middle East today. Without Sykes-Picot, countries like Iraq, Jordan, Israel and Palestine, and modern-day Syria and Lebanon would not exist, nor would their associated conflicts. In this video, we're going to look at how the 1916 Sykes-Picot Agreement created the modern Middle East. Before we get started, a quick word from my sponsor, Ground News.
The news is divided. Ground News puts it back together, so you can see how many sources are reporting on any breaking story, where they fall on the political spectrum, how reliable they are, and who owns them. Compare headlines and read full articles to see which details are prioritized, exaggerated, or left out entirely. Because the more we understand the media, the more we'll understand each other. Visit ground.news to learn more.
With my thanks to Ground News, back to the video. The First World War broke out in August 1914. Ottoman Turkey, the main hegemon in the Middle East, joined the war on the side of the Central Powers alongside Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Bulgaria. The Ottoman Empire had been in decline since the 18th century, having lost much of their holdings in the Balkans and in North Africa. The kingdoms on the Arabian Peninsula, meanwhile, were practically autonomous. Britain was the dominant European power on the peninsula and wished to A. maintain freedom of navigation through the region's shipping lanes, and B. to secure the approaches to India. London was concerned about the threat that the Ottomans posed to British possessions such as the Suez Canal. The idea of supporting an Arab revolt within the Ottoman territories had been conceived. Let me talk a little bit about Arab nationalism. An Arab nationalist movement began to coalesce in the second half of the 19th century. Arabs in Syria and Lebanon promoted a Syrian consciousness and patriotism that made no distinctions along racial or religious lines. It was Maronite Christians in Lebanon who served as the primary motors for this form of early Arab nationalism. In the late 1870s and early 1880s, posters calling for an Arab revolt and denouncing the tyranny of the Ottomans appeared in cities like Beirut and Damascus. However, this Arab proto-nationalism died down in the following decades, and expressions of it were less visible. In the first decade of the 1900s, Arab nationalism experienced a revival. Abd al-Rahman al-Kawakibi, an Aleppo-born intellectual, was the pioneer of modern secular pan-Arabism. Najib Azuri, a Maronite Christian, was the first to publicly advocate for a secular Arab nationalism. So now let's talk a little bit more about the treaty. Sir Mark Sykes, a Tory MP in Britain's Parliament and War Minister Horatio Kitchener's personal representative, supported Arab independence from the Ottomans and a form of Arab autonomy under British influence. Interestingly enough, Sykes had a negative opinion of both Arabs and of Jews. In 1914, the British were in contact with Hussein ibn Ali, the emir of Mecca and later the king of the Hejaz. They instructed Hussein to bide his time. As a carrot, the British dangled in front of him the prospect of control over the caliphate or the whole of Islam. Hussein demanded British support for an independent Arab kingdom made up of the Arab provinces of the Ottoman Empire. At this point, the British had backed themselves into a corner. They could not reject his territorial claims and jeopardize the revolt, but they couldn't accept them either, as the British had their own interests at stake in the region too. London stipulated that the Syrian coast, including modern-day Lebanon, was to be excluded from the future independent Arab state and under French or joint Franco-British control. This likewise applied to modern-day Iraq too. Present-day Syria and Jordan were to become part of the future Arab state, along with the Arabian Peninsula. Palestine had not been explicitly mentioned anywhere. Author Benny Morris writes, "By independence, the British meant independence from Turkey. Certainly they had not intended to promise or grant the Arabs full-fledged independent statehood. I should say, however, that territorial expansion was not Britain's endgame in the region. Essentially, the British wanted to control the Ottoman Arab provinces in the same way they had exercised control over the Gulf monarchies like Bahrain and the Trucial states. For London, it was more about political and economic influence rather than conquest or settlement. The British regarded Hussein and the Arabs in general as untrustworthy actors. Benny Morris says, "The feeling in Whitehall was that Britain had traded relatively empty promises for relatively empty assurances from Hussein, whose Arabian cohorts were insignificant and whose following in Syria and Mesopotamia was negligible." Britain and France began talks in late 1915, with the latter being represented by François-Georges Picot, first secretary of the French embassy in London. The Sykes-Picot Agreement was concluded on January 3, 1916, delineating each country's zones of control. In this agreement, France was given control over Lebanon and the northwestern Syrian coast. Britain was awarded control over the provinces of Basra and Baghdad in Mesopotamia. The area in between was split between the British and the French. France controlled the northern half, including the Aleppo-Damascus line and the area east of it up to Mosul. Britain received the Negev Desert, Transjordan, and most of modern-day Iraq. Palestine was earmarked for joint Franco-British rule. In June 1916, Hussein ibn Ali led a revolt against the Ottoman Empire. However, this revolt did not attract as much of a following as had been anticipated. No major Ottoman Arab military formations defected to the rebels' cause, and the Levant also did not join in the revolt. Military actions during the revolt were limited to a few thousand tribesmen from the Hejaz, with assistance from British gunboats. The British also sent military advisors and generous amounts of gold to the Arabs. London spent £11 million, the equivalent of over £1 billion in 2025 money, subsidizing the revolt. In March 1917, an Anglo-Indian force captured Baghdad. The British invasion of Palestine got off to a poor start when the British were defeated in Gaza in March. In June, a new commander was appointed to command the British forces, General Edmund Allenby. On December 11, 1917, General Allenby's forces entered Jerusalem. Due to a limited number of troops at his disposal, Allenby only resumed offensive actions in September 1918. On September 25th, Amman, the present-day capital of Jordan, fell to British forces. To the east, Hussein's army, aided by the famed T.E. Lawrence, would triumphantly enter Damascus on October 3rd. 2 days later, Arab forces under Faisal, Hussein's son, entered Beirut and hoisted their flag. The following day, French troops arrived and took over control of the city. Now let's talk about another sticking point that the Sykes-Picot Agreement created: the competing Jewish-Arab claims over the land of Palestine. In November 1917, London issued the Balfour Declaration, calling for a Jewish national home in Palestine. But the Arabs, more specifically the Hashemites, Hussein's family under King Faisal, believed that Palestine was included in what the British promised them as well. In April 1918, General Allenby established the Occupied Enemy Territory Administration, or OETA, to govern Palestine. The British excluded the French from Palestine altogether. Much of the OETA's senior leadership held negative views toward both Jews and Arabs. Indeed, many British officers believed that the Zionists were making their task of administering the area more difficult. OETA curbed Jewish migration to Palestine too. During the period of the British mandate over Palestine, London managed to arouse the ire of both the Jews and the Arabs. While the British authorities had allowed for a Jewish national home on paper, their policy was best described by Ze'ev Jabotinsky in 1918. The official approach is to apologize to the Arabs for a slip of the tongue by Mr. Balfour. Just like in Africa, borders and spheres of influence arbitrarily drawn up by the Europeans with no regard for the realities on the ground were the name of the game. However, it must be stated that the subsequent 1920 San Remo Conference superseded the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Still, various religious and ethnic groups' competing aspirations of national self-determination were apparently of little genuine concern to the British. Modern-day Iraq, with its current borders, did not exist before Europeans took over in the 20th century. The same goes for Syria and Jordan. Jordan, or Transjordan as it was known back then, was an artificial British creation. While the borders conceived of in 1916 are not the same as they are today, the legacy of the Sykes-Picot Agreement still engenders resentment among Arabs. The First World War had earth-shattering consequences which we can still feel today. One of these consequences was the secret Sykes-Picot Agreement made between Britain and France in 1916. As London and Paris carved up the Middle East like a turkey, the populations within the Middle East were the ones who ended up paying the heaviest price. More than 100 years on, the Middle East still bears the scars inflicted on it by European imperialism. This, mixed with the influence of 19th century European nationalism, became a deadly cocktail of long-standing ethnic and religious hatred. What do you guys think? Are there any other agreements similar to Sykes-Picot that have had as monumental of an impact? How would a map that reflects the true ethnic and religious realities of the Middle East look? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching.